Hello and welcome to the Periphery. I'm your host, Alan Elrod, and my guest today is Samuel C. Spitale, and he is a media studies expert. He's written for the Huffington Post and Geek magazine, Advocate.com, and before that, he worked at Lucasfilm in global product development, and he is also the author of Star Wars: Collecting a Galaxy. But we're not going to be talking about Star Wars: Collecting a Galaxy today. We're actually going to be talking about another book that Samuel has written, titled How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. That book is also illustrated by Alan Winship. I think it's a really great book. I'm excited to talk to Samuel. So Samuel, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I think first off, I just want to start with, I love the format you went with this, the visual format of illustrating. Because, I think there's a lot of work coming out right now about this crisis we're having, about truth and reality and how to deal with disinformation and misinformation. Some of it is more about the political dynamics of that. Some of it's more about the sort of infrastructure of the web and those things. But I think what sets this book apart is, at least in one way, the visual approach you guys chose to take. That there's all these charts and graphs, but not just charts and graphs. These really sort of comic panel type things that help us think through some of the topics you explore. So I think first and foremost, I was curious, what made you pick that way of going about it? Because in my mind, it's very effective. But I'm curious, like what instinctively made you think this is a good way to talk about this stuff?
Sure. So, I kind of consider the book a nonfiction graphic novel. It may be more, it may count more as just fully illustrated, but there is art on every page. It doesn't necessarily have all the panels of a graphic novel, but it is, fully illustrated. And the artist, Alan Winship, did a phenomenal job. I forget exactly how many illustrations are in there, but it's a ton, multiple on each page. And I kind of conceived the book as an illustrated book. I kind of modeled it after this very cool graphic novel called Economics, with an X, Economics, by Michael Goodwin. And it's like the history of world economics from the past to the present. And it's kind of in graphic novel form, which gives it this kind of nice sense of humor and whimsy, but an ability to make the material fun when the material may not otherwise be fun. And so I was really inspired by that book, but I also knew that I wanted a lot of tables and graphs and charts and things to help illustrate the points, especially when you're dealing with data and trends over time. And I had this critical thinking learning tool that I thought was very important to include in the book, which is, this pie chart kind of framework to break down ideas, and to kind of challenge black and white thinking and see the shades of gray and nuance to different subjects. And so I knew there needed to be some type of illustrated component. And my agent and the publisher, Quirk Books, they both like the idea of fully illustrated. There's this trend these days to take a lot of these big nonfiction books and then turn them into graphic novels, like Sapiens or Lies My Teacher Told Me and these other things. So we kind of thought, well, let's just go straight to the graphic format. And, it might be the best way to represent the material and make it accessible to the widest possible audience. And so, so that's kind of how we did it. And I'm really pleased with how it turned out. And the illustrations add a lot of levity to the subject matter, and add a lot of fun to it.
Yeah, I think the illustrations, they do that. They make it fun, and they keep, like you said, they keep a certain amount of levity because some of this stuff is pretty bleak.
Right. There's a lot of heavy data in there. Yeah.
Right. You mentioned, so I'm gonna go to it, the little pie chart that you use, this 4-quadrant pie chart you use throughout the book, and this chart helps you, I think, lay out the way you kind of focus on how we sort of take in information in this sort of way in which information presented to us and how we process it. And you have kind of a negative and a positive quadrant. You have a sort of synthesis quadrant of how you sort of find the middle ground between these positions. And then you also have this other that I think is really critical in the book, which is self-deception. And part of what I find really compelling about the way you come back to self-deception throughout the book, and I think also interesting for the book as a whole, is this is a book that is, yes, you spend a lot of time talking about the people who lie and companies that have lied, about product safety. You talk about politicians that have manipulated emotions. You talk about, bad actors in various ways, historians that have misrepresented the past. But one of the things that comes through this is the fact that there is always an element in which we play a part in our own believing of mistruths, that there is always this kind of part of us that's involved, that we whether it's through bias, some of it unconscious in the brain, and some of it through the stories we want to tell ourselves actively, that there's always a role for the person receiving the information when it comes to how their reality is distorted. And I feel like that's a very important part of the book, that it's not just a book about deceivers and bad actors preying on people. It's also a book about how people allow themselves to take up these beliefs that are faulty, and not only that, to really rigorously defend them, like kind of fend off attempts to dispel those mistruths.
Yeah. This is like a two-part process. It's not just the bad actors who are seeding misinformation to someone's political or corporate gain. And they should be the ones at fault and held accountable and, blamed for the proliferation of misinformation, because they are the responsible parties. Yet it wouldn't work if we weren't susceptible to these types of appeals. And a lot of our susceptibility, comes from just how we're psychologically wired. They know how to manipulate and which buttons to push. And unless we are versed or educated in that discipline, we may not realize it. And so I think that goes for, media literacy, our inability to distinguish, a news item from marketing or advertising or branding or public relations. And it is very confusing and unclear, especially when, we're not just getting information from news broadcasts anymore. We're getting it from tweets and Facebook posts and texts. And so information, or whatever you want to call it, is everywhere these days. And most of it's noise, not news. And so if you don't have, the communication background to differentiate the news from the noise, then, you can easily believe an item when it comes up, without kind of analyzing it properly. And, the media literacy part is just one part of the problem. The other part is all of our cognitive biases and, these kind of defense mechanisms and our fight or flight response and, all the things that influence us in ways we're not consciously aware of. And so, in the book, I have this huge kind of chart of all of our biases and fallacies, and so many of them we're not aware of. So what I tried to do as many tests in the book, or tests, I should say, more like exercises, where you can kind of test your own implicit bias, and how we're very much prone to accept information that makes us look good, and and reject information that makes us look bad, and accept information that makes other groups who aren't like us look bad. And, we're just, there's just so many biases in our day-to-day lives that we're kind of oblivious to until someone, points them out. And so I'm kind of fascinated by cognitive science and neuroscience and all of the ways we deceive ourselves. There's so many phenomenal books about this subject that, each time I read one, I'm just kind of blown away. I'll throw out a few just for your listeners if they're interested in reading more about the psychology of some of this, but The Believing Brain by Michael Shermer is a great book. The Invisible Gorilla is a great book. Naturally Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Just all the areas of this kind of cognitive research is yeah, I find it fascinating. The answers, so many of these things lie in the brain, and we're just kind of oblivious to a lot of it.
Something that I think ties into this is and is in fact a mechanism behind some of our biases and the reasons why we engage in self-deception in the first place, right? Is you spend a good amount of time on emotions in the book and how emotions play into our thinking. And you do a pretty good job, and I think you lay out a really rich set of emotions, right? You start with some of the core emotions that sort of social psychologists have outlined, and then you sort of talk about what it would look like to expand those to a really big, of a kind of massive, takes up like a full page in the book pie chart of sort of all the different kinds of emotions that can spin out from these kind of core feelings. I think they're like fear, disgust, anger, joy. There's some others, and I think it's really important because part of what you're getting at, I think, is that one, these big emotions do drive us, but also then that there's a lot of nuance between, there are emotions that might both sort of fall into the negative categories of and might involve some sort of cocktail of fear and anger, but repulsion may not be the same as contempt or even disgust, and that these things have, even if they're maybe somewhat perforated, they have boundaries between them in terms of how they affect our thinking, and that we should be attentive to these little tiny nuances in our feelings, in terms of how different emotions correspond, right, to cognition around different issues.
Yeah, I feel like emotional awareness is kind of one of those things that no one, not many people are familiar with because our educational system is very focused on like critical thinking or ideally and kind of an IQ, improving your IQ and developing your IQ. But there's studies and scientists that show that your EQ, your emotional intelligence, is just as important. And that's kind of the realm of psychology or therapists. And it's also the realm of art and actors. And so artists and psychologists, it's studying emotional awareness and working with emotions helps kind of see misinformation and see manipulation at work in ways the average person may not. Because emotions are, what I use in the book is, emotions are the subtext behind the text. So if we think of our day-to-day actions as the text, we do this, we do that, we want this, we want that, the emotions are what's driving us. And so the emotions are kind of the hidden motivator behind our thoughts and actions. And so they drive us to do all sorts of things. It's kind of like why they exist. And so, good things, bad things, but our negative emotions are particularly strong because we have this negativity bias where it's kind of an adaptive response that kept us alive back in the day. Our ancestors developed this fight or flight response to where if we were fearful or in danger, we would act on it and try to save ourselves or preserve ourselves. And so, that system still functions much the same way today, except instead of, tigers or bears or whatever, activating us, we have people doing it with advertising or marketing or political communication. And, people are trying to manipulate us emotionally to get us to do something they want. And so, you think of advertising, you need fear to sell handguns or car alarms or whatever. You look at most advertising and you could, if you study it, you can identify the emotion they're trying to elicit. When it comes to makeup or beauty products, they often feed on either, insecurity or our desire to be prettier and look better and have more self-confidence, or it's a lot of these kind of labels, don't get used. But when you're in therapy, for instance, if you're telling a story, it's the text, and then if the psychologist is making notes, it's usually about the subtext. What emotions are behind this? What are the fears? What's the subconscious doing? And so becoming aware of our emotions can definitely help catch the manipulation. And one of the examples I use in the book is partisan media, because I feel like partisan media, that's what they trade off of, are emotions. Fox News is the easiest example, but when you think, if you watch the news, you should not leave watching the news angry or disgusted or fearful or irate. Information should not make you any of those things. And so if you watch these anchors' delivery of, in partisan news, they're deliberately trying to rile up the audience or direct anger or hate at somebody. They're trying to make you outraged. Outrage is the brand. And so that's not news, that's propaganda. Um, you know, People don't need, if you're selling the truth, or if you're delivering information, you don't have to rely on an emotional delivery. And so, yeah, becoming aware of when our emotions are evoked, especially when it comes to news items or messages or things in our feed on social media. Beware of the negative emotions. That's very often a sign someone's trying to arouse us deliberately.
I'm really glad that you went into the sort of EQ, IQ, especially the way critical thinking is taught, because I think it gets us into the dilemma that's there. I mean, you mentioned text and subtext. I think the dilemma that's there in the subtext of your book all along, in a lot of ways, is there is an asymmetry right now in how the war on truth is being fought. A lot of the people who are frustrated with the misinformation going around do want to dial back the temperature. But the problem with that is that it in kind of going with what you said, by dialing back the temperature and making the truth and the stuff that is more factual and the stuff that is more rooted in reality, by also dialing down the emotions on it, in some way we also dial down how attractive it is to people. It's like we're presenting the sugar-free version of information, where, and this is something, this was a huge debate, right? In 2020, even in something like the Democratic primary, right? There was a sort of you know should Democrats, nominate someone in the vein of, and it wasn't just Joe Biden, but a kind of Joe Biden or an Amy Klobuchar or a Pete Buttigieg, who were, I think, very much trying to set the temperature very low, right? But it wasn't just about whether they were sort of more to the center or more to the left. It was about tone, right? Or, is what the left needs, or even the Democratic Party needs in that moment to challenge Donald Trump, right? Is it someone who's just as brash? And I'm not comparing the actual substance of someone like Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump, because I don't think they're comparable in that sense. But the tone, right? Someone who will also shout, someone who will also sort of rile people up, someone who also elicits strong emotions from their followers, right? Is distinct, and I think that presents a real dilemma for people, right? Because on the one hand, you're correct, I think, right? Facts alone should not leave you in this highly agitated state, right? At the same time, this war on truth is a push and pull, and how I think how we win it is hard, right? Because I think, and look, you even see that on the kind of never Trump side, where you have, I think, much more kind of staid and low key approaches from people, like maybe Michael Steele or I think who else comes to mind in that moment, Charlie Sykes. And you also have the sort of very dialed up. The Lincoln Project is incredibly. They're very much playing the game of let's get emotions high, let's get people angry, let's make people upset at what Donald Trump did, etc. So I think to me it's clear that there's a lot of tension in our moment about sort of is the best way to deal with sort of a rising illiberal authoritarian kind of propagandist movement on the far right. Is the best way to deal with it to kind of keep trying to tamp down the flames, keep trying to turn down the temperature, keep trying to just do, steady as she goes? Or is the best way to turn up the volume a little and fight fire with fire? And I'm putting this to you, I think, in the context of your book, because I want your thoughts. But I do see that tension playing out between people who are essentially on the same side, right? No, none of these people are suggesting like let's necessarily lie to people, but there is, I think, a certain amount of disagreement about how to deal with some of the threats.
Yeah, I guess that's probably one of the big questions. The problem is that was that Hillary said low, when you go low, we go high, or whatever. The problem with that is going high often doesn't move the needle. So, but going low does. And this is part of the problem with the politics right now, is that both sides are not proposing solutions. We only have really one side that's proposing solutions, and then the other side is just trying to make you angry about all those solutions. And instead of offering counter solutions. And so, political attack ads are a great example. There's a reason most countries don't allow them, because they work. They work because they're manipulative. They stir up hate, outrage, and disgust, and they're red flags for manipulation. And most of the time, if you watch them, they are from politicians that are distracting us from their policies by demonizing their opponents. And this technique, it's been called positive polarization in the Nixon years. It was called rejectionist voting, I think, in the Reagan years. Basically is, this idea that you don't have to stand for anything. You don't have to be the candidate people want. All you have to do is get the public to hate the other candidate. And as long as they hate them, you can benefit from that and get elected. And so that's kind of what we're witnessing a lot these days. We see it more on the right. And people could say, oh, but people hate Trump. And I would say, yeah, people do hate Trump, but they're not hating Trump because of what people are telling them to do. They're hating Trump because of what he does. His crimes, his actions, his all of the horrible track record of the last 6, 7, 8 years. But these days, you think of what the right is running on. They're not proposing solutions. They are trying to get you to hate wokeness or universal health care or a Jobs Act or COVID stimulus or COVID restrictions, or you insert fill in the blank. They're not proposing solutions to anything. They're not trying to fix society's problems. If anything, they're trying to keep those problems from getting solved because their constituents don't want those problems solved. The gun lobby does not want gun regulations or gun restrictions. The healthcare lobby does not want universal healthcare. The finance lobby does not want free college tuition. So when you have positive things being offered, like say by Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg or any of these people, they're all positive things for society. Free college tuition, universal health care, student loan forgiveness, whatever it is, those are all positive societal benefits. However, someone, the only person that's losing when those things happen are big corporations or, finance industry or the pharmaceutical industry or whoever. So in order to protect their profits and their business model, their political mouthpieces have to convince us to hate those things and rile us up and make us fearful, or and so it's just such an easy fallback to fight progress or solutions when you don't have a better option. And so I would say that's probably the key takeaway for anyone listening, is that when politicians are demonizing um, efforts to fix some type of societal issue, that means they don't have a counter argument or proposal. They're basically just trying to keep that problem from getting solved. Because if you have solutions, if you have policies, you run on those policies. So, and I think, you mentioned Bernie Sanders, and I think he's a great example because he's not demonizing opponents. He is literally proposing solutions. And I think that's why Bernie Sanders had such a huge following. Again, it's easy to compare him and Trump, but they're two completely separate human beings. Like when they were both running in 2015, Trump was running on this hate, this anti-immigrant sentiment, this, drain the swamp. Everything was negative, and it was all about hating the system and hating this, hating that. And
Right. Yeah.
Bernie,
I hope I should say I don't. I don't. To me, the volume is the only similar. Like, there's no. I don't think that
right,
that Bernie is. I do think there's a lazy kind of both sidesism that says, oh well, the right has Trump and these shouty people like Trump and Gates, and the left has Bernie and AOC, and I'm just like, well, they're just not the
yeah,
same. Because at the end of the
they're
day,
totally different. But I think they
Bernie
get
Sanders
compared.
and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, right? They actually
Right.
want to legislate.
Because, well, and they get compared, at least back in 2015, because they were both kind of disruption candidates, so they weren't the status quo. And so I think that made it easy for people to lump them in as like, oh, alternates or alternatives. But to me, they're like, night and day. They're like, Trump is like the inverse of Bernie if he was evil, or like kind of a thing. It's everything Bernie wanted was a solution, like invest in schools, roads, and bridges, transition to renewable energies, restore collective bargaining and unions, make public college tuition free, break up the big banks. Like everything he was running on, and every time you see him speak on CNN or whatever, everything out of his mouth is solution, solution, solution. We needed
Well, so
this,
to
we needed
me,
this, we needed this.
this gets at something I'd wanted to get into, but we're talking about it right now, which is it gets back to your book, which is there is this link, right? We mentioned earlier, it's not just about the people who are bad face seeding information. It's also about the audience and what the audience wants and chooses to believe. And I think a lot of this is about the fact that, at this moment in time, there are people on the left who I think who have engaged in bad faith. I would say, Jill Stein. I don't particularly think Marianne Williamson is a very honest person. Tulsi Gabbard, before now she's sort of left the Democratic Party. There are people, they perform really poorly in the Democratic primaries on the left. And I don't think it's because people who are on the left side of the spectrum are immune to this stuff. Part of what I think it gets at, and you mentioned Nixon, so this lets us have this conversation, because this is what I think ultimately, and I'm curious what you think, which is the long Southern strategy, which we had Angie Maxwell on this podcast a long time ago, right back when we launched. I know you are familiar with her.
She's great. Yeah.
She's amazing, right? Her great work on the long Southern strategy, which is there was both the intentional people who went out and cultivated this politics of resentment and anger and status anxiety, particularly in the American South in the wake of civil rights reform. And then there were a lot of other politicians, I think, who thought, not that that stuff was good, but okay, what's the harm in throwing them a bone every once in a while? Because this is what you get where you hear people, I think Charlie Sykes will talk sometimes about, I always thought that this bad stuff, this really angry, racist, resentful, cultural warrior stuff, I always thought this was the recessive gene. And I'm not sure it's worth having a debate over whether it was the recessive gene or not. What I do think is true is part of how you get to the point where on one side, the reason you're getting this stuff like Trump is because to a degree, it's what the people want is a long, slow cultivation of that, right? And I think it gets at that tension between messenger and audience, where it is a two-way street, right? This is the problem that Fox had, right? With to a degree their Dominion scandal was like you can only feed people this kind of stuff so long before you have cultivated a certain kind of audience that wants certain things. And now, if you try to give them something different, if you're to say, wait, actually, no, whoa, like they don't want that. They don't want that at all. And
Yeah, you kind of created a monster that you can't control. And they've been creating this monster for over 50 years now. But I think the monster's the size it is because of, I think, a lot of factors. Yes, the strategists were bad actors that instead of getting on board with civil rights, they just saw it as racism as a political weapon that they could use. And so they weaponized it. What's happened is that in the Trump era, the Fox News era, the subtext of the Southern strategy has been elevated to the text. Mm-hmm. And so they're no longer, whispering the quiet part. Now they're yelling it. And I think that's why, it's been dormant, or not dormant, it's been there. It's just been kind of on the back burner for a long time. And within the last, 10 years, with the start of the Obama years, I think we began to see it more and more. And again, I think part of it is, like I mentioned earlier, they're not standing for much these days. The reality is their positions on economic issues and social issues are not popular. They only benefit the wealthy 1%ers and corporations. Conservative neoliberal policy has basically created this current, clusterfuck in America of staggering inequality that's the biggest since the Great Depression, widespread poverty, homelessness. This is what happens when we don't invest in social welfare programs, when we give tax cuts to corporations, when we defund public institutions. We're at a breaking point where the inequality and the poverty is so widespread, there's so much job insecurity, that if we keep going in this direction, things aren't going to be able to hold. We have to reinvest in society. We have to fund things. We have there has to be a breaking point to where society works for more than just the uber wealthy and the corporations. And Republican policy, though, it only makes these situations worse. And so, they can't campaign on more tax cuts for the wealthy, more, deregulate pollution standards so that corporations can pollute all they want and people can die more easily. None of their positions benefit society at this point in time. And so they have to rely on anger and identity politics and all of this cultural, craziness.
By the way, there's probably not much more cognitive dissonance to me than seeing some of this stuff where it's become so policy nihilistic in a way that even some of the companies they're offering to deregulate, well, no, we're gonna do that anyway, right? We've actually seen sometimes where even the car industry is well, we're still gonna make EVs, because this is where the industry is going, and
right.
We don't want to go back to.
It's very, one of the things that I guess I find, find the most fascinating is before I was even remotely interested in politics, I still read a lot. And if you're reading books by academics and scientists and, excuse me, and experts in any given field across the globe, the research and what they're saying is pretty uniform. Like everyone's agreeing these are the problems. If there's much deviation, it's in how do we solve these problems? And even then, it's still, we know what we have to do to solve global warming. Like, it's not like we don't have an answer. We just don't like the answer. Why don't we like the answer? Because the oil and gas industry has a lot of money and they don't want to lose their business model. And it's really that simple. So all of the doubt around climate change, all of the reluctance to shift to renewable energies, all of that is manufactured by the oil and gas industry. And so that's the real reason Republicans don't want any of this stuff, is because they need their oil money. Like, they need the money to get elected. That's why they get elected, is to protect them. And so I think the reason politics have become so bad is that, one party has a platform that's really only causing all of our problems at this point in time. And to me, what's so crazy about Bernie Sanders and the so-called socialist Democrats, most of the things they want to do, we've done before in this country. Like, we've already done. We had the GI Bill. College was pretty much free. California colleges were tuition free until the protests in the 60s pissed off Reagan and he started charging tuition. Like, so many of the things that make society better that are, now they would label socialized, we've already done. Like, it's that those protections have been slowly stripped away over the last 50, 60 years. The
I think,
the banks, go ahead. Sorry.
No, so I just wanted to hop in because what you're saying is interesting too, because it gets back to your point of cognitive dissonance. And I want to say, in parentheses, kind of full credit to a lot of the people who are now never Trumpers, who I think left the party, or not even left the party, but felt like the party left them because they really were in it for ideas and they did have policy proposals. Yeah. But we are not set up the way voters, you mentioned, you also spend a lot of time in your book talking about heuristics and sort of informational shortcuts we use to make choices. Voters are not really, and people are not geared for an environment in which one party doesn't have ideas. Like, and you see it in the news media, you see it in elections. Like, when people say, oh, well, isn't it crazy that you have one party so far off the rails? And yet, I'm not upset that center-right policy proposals could get 50% plus one of the vote. But what's crazy is if you have somebody who's just running saying like, I didn't lose the last, elections are a fraud and, et cetera. And these things are still, you're going to come close to 50. And I think a big part of that is just, there's the sophisticated analysis of partisan identity and how people operate in a political space and polarization. But there's also just the more base level of, on a cognitive level, we do not know how to process the idea that one party is just actually not functioning.
No, and they are, and they've become so extremist. And because it's been a slow, we were talking earlier, I was talking so much, I didn't get to this point. But, one of the reasons is that, the fairness doctrine, which used to require media outlets report both sides to controversial issues, was, disbanded and thrown away in the 80s. And then after that, it allowed for the proliferation of talk radio. And so overnight, you had all these really hyper-partisan talk radio channels popping up, like Rush Limbaugh is the main one that comes to mind. And Rush Limbaugh is a good example because it's not like he was offering policy solutions. He's just basically offering hate and fear-mongering. He's just smearing opponents. He's making fun of people. He's there's no intellectual debate on shows like that. It's just kind of brainwashing you to hate the people he hates and to hate the parts of the culture he hates, right? And I think we see that today in stuff like all the trans opposition. Like being anti-trans or anti-woke, like that's not a political solution. Like that's, like you have a group of people who are seeking their civil rights and their civil protections. So being against that is not really a platform. That's just kind of being a cruel human being, and so that's not a position, that's a reaction to something. That's a reaction to positive change. It's a reaction to other things. Like that in and of itself is not your position. Like, your policies and positions can't just be a negative reaction to whatever's going on in the world. Like you have to stand for something. You can't just stand against something. And so with the dawn of, all these right-wing radio um, shows, you kind of just had this indoctrination over and over of like being anti stuff. It was a lot of hate spewing. And then when Clinton got elected, whenever the Republicans are out of power, the hate machine just ratchets up even more and that's a slow evolution. And Newt Gingrich helped that, just demonizing your opponents and kind of just, skating by on just that, on just selling the hate and the opposition. And so it got worse during the Clinton years. Talk radio propelled it. Then Fox News comes along and kind of this, anti-progress, anti-liberalism kind of becomes the ideology as opposed to classic conservative.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's not fashionable a lot of times to say nice things. Well, it's become more about George W. Bush, but even something like what doesn't get as much attention, right? His PEPFAR program, right? The president's emergency plan for AIDS relief, right? Which is this massive global initiative that has absolutely helped reduce the number of AIDS deaths worldwide in a significant way, right? Okay, well, that is an unalloyed good, right? And there was a time when we would have this conversation where you could have presidents from different parts of the political spectrum, and you might object, and maybe even object strenuously. Obviously, we can find some pretty big foreign policy failures in the George W. Bush administration, not least of which being the entire Iraq War. But you can also still point to some things that are. This is a policy plan rooted in the realistic assessment of an actual problem and that he wanted to do something about, and it succeeded. And now we have what amounts to anti-policy, right? There is no
yes. Right.
That is a world that people are just not prepared to exist in at all.
No. And that's what one of the parties has become. And part of that reason is, again, the shift in political warfare, the shift in politics that Newt Gingrich really helped and Fox News kind of exploited. Every time the left would try to reach across the aisle or try to become more center to compromise, instead of the right working with them, they just became more extremist. Because again, they started becoming anti whatever the left is, as opposed to having their own positions. They're just anti whatever the left is, and it could be something as stupid as mask mandates. Like it almost doesn't matter what it is. It is at this point any single thing that is perceived as leftist or that the left wants to do, even if it's an action that is not political, that is just doing the right thing or based in science, then the right is now against it because, it's almost reflexive now because, again, they don't stand for anything. They only stand against whatever's going on. And whether that's COVID mandates or, forgiving student loan debt, it almost doesn't matter. Or sending money to Ukraine, it's almost so farcical now that when they're against something, it basically means that they're against their previous position. And I think, the sending aid to Ukraine is a great example. Now, all of a sudden, we're anti-war. Like the party that drove us into two unwinnable wars in the Middle East is all of a sudden now, or it's the pro-Russia sympathy. Why is there a pro-Russia sympathy? Like, it's whatever anti, the other side is proposing. And, maybe part of the problem too is that the left has gone too center over the last 30 years, which they have. Our left is not left in other countries. The American left is seen as center right in most countries. Because those countries have all the things that we still don't have. They have universal health care. They have free college. They have, they have all of these programs that we can't seem to have in this country, or programs that we used to have until, we stopped funding them so that we could give wealthy people more tax breaks. um,
This is, I think, an area though where I don't know if I want to push back, but I want to probe you on this, which
mhm.
is because when I think about this stuff, I do think that this matters when I hear conversations about sort of policy ideas on say the left, which is uh you know, there is a tendency, right? We've just had a long conversation about we have one party that's very geared up to say no to things. And frankly, even before that became a problem, we have a political system, a structural system that makes saying no and then finding ways to turn that no into a compromise really the design of the system. And sometimes I wonder about the dissonance it has created on the left side of the political spectrum between policy proposals that may in and of themselves not be, I think, objectionable, but that probably have very little likelihood of traveling through the political system without undergoing some form of compromise and transformation. Because I think that also does create a certain amount of disillusionment and frustration, and maybe even can lead to challenges we talk about, like apathy or a sense of alienation from the political system, because, you know, this happened in the fights around Medicare for all, right? Where I found that to be personally a very frustrating thing to listen to, because what I thought I was listening to was a lot of people talking about, and this is to a degree this is what always happens in primaries, but a lot of people talking about different plans and whose plan was better, but always in this kind of idealized sense of as if none of these plans are going to undergo the legislative process of being turned into something that actually gets passed into law. And of course, almost none of them are going to happen in that initial form. And to me, it felt like there was a generation of voters that were being set up in that conversation to potentially feel very let down, because the reality of how politics actually operates, how, for to use the kind of adage, how the sausage is sort of made, means that these things aren't going to be done in the ways that they are talked about. And obviously there's an important place in the art of persuasion. We're talking about the uncompromised version of an idea. But at the same time, when there is a sort of it will just happen, it will get done messaging, I think that presents some really dangerous pitfalls to how people respond when it doesn't get done.
Yeah, I guess. Well, what's the question? Or what do you want me? What
I'm
do you
curious how
want
you
me to
think
weigh in
about
on?
that on the sort of side of, these, I think these, I wonder if you worry in this conversation about truth and how people relate to the political system as it actually is, not maybe always as we hope it would be. When even when it comes to policies that you might think are better, when there's not enough perhaps acknowledgement that these things don't travel through the political system unchanged, they do get shifted, they do get shaped. There is sometimes they just don't happen, and that is part of the process, and we have to kind of deal with that, because I do worry sometimes about the alienation and frustration and disillusionment that emerges on what I see sometimes, especially the younger left part of the American political spectrum, about these issues. And I think that is in some degrees a product of that dissonance of the messaging, which is very kind of idealized, and the reality, which is, even before we reached this kind of incredible crisis moment where one party is as dysfunctional as it is, our political system simply doesn't produce tidy, outcomes. It produces friction and compromise.
True. And even, policies or programs with the best intentions, by the time, they're enacted, so much has been carved out to serve special interests and corporations. And, things that would have helped the people the most have been weakened because of, again, the influence of special interests, especially in the corporate space. Um, and yes, it's easy to get disillusioned. I think the thing is you have to always be fighting for these things. Um, and it's really hard to move the needle. Guns is probably one of the easiest. Um, it's even if the people want it, it's impossible for it to get anywhere. And why? Well, because the NRA has done such a great job of getting their politicians in line. I think one of the I look at everything kind of as through this democracy versus capitalism filter. So for any of these issues, um, something's either going to help the people or it's going to help corporate profits. And so if you can figure out, um, the way you can figure out usually the misinformation or the BS, um, because it almost always comes from whichever side's corporate profits are being threatened. And so, what's the real reason we don't have gun reform? Because of the gun lobby, because it makes too much money for them. So I feel like, the debate so often is the Second Amendment and all this, and all they're doing is just they're citing the script that the NRA and the gun lobby has written. The whole idea that guns, everybody having a gun is a Second Amendment thing, is like PR from the gun lobby that they created around the 70s. Like the Second Amendment was never for that. It was to establish a militia because we didn't have a militia at the time. And so, using the Second Amendment as an excuse to basically regulate guns in the same way we had regulated them 30, 40, 50 years ago is just absurd. It was the Bush administration that let the assault rifle ban expire. And that's why, the mass shootings have skyrocketed. And so now all of a sudden the debate for banning assault rifles is like a Second Amendment issue, and it's like, this is something we've already done. Like, the debate should be, why did we allow that to expire in the first place? And, the journalism should be focused on the gun lobby forces that push the Bush administration to let the ban expire so they could sell more firearms. So I feel like a lot of the, I don't know, I guess exploring the corporate reasons why legislation gets killed or weakened is the important part of understanding why we can't seem to do these things. I don't know if that quite hits what we were talking about.
Well, I mean, I wanted your kind of your thoughts on it, and I think that certainly, to me, I think, and maybe this is a good last kind of, before we get to our search chatter question, last way to talk and think about it, which is democracy is a messy thing, and the challenge when we're talking about, I think, something like a war for truth is this incredible high wire act that has to be walked by citizens of a democracy, of a pluralist, open, diverse democracy, which is having convictions and positions and accepting that other people will disagree with us, and finding a way where we don't confuse every time someone disagrees with us for dishonesty or lying or manipulation. And at the same time, recognizing that the commitments to pluralism, free speech, and tolerance that strengthen and allow a democracy to thrive also do allow in those people and those actors who do want to manipulate and lie and say things. And to me, I think that's such a fundamental thing at the core of your book and at the moment we're in, which is being citizens in a democracy, encountering difference and disagreement, or things that just don't line up with how we see the world, and being able to somehow get through that moment of cognitive dissonance to deal with whether not everything is going to be the way we want it to be. Not everyone will agree with us. There are always going to be legitimate and healthy political disagreements. And at the same time, there are all these pitfalls of real, manipulative, dangerous, we've seen, right? Not just dangerous in the sense that they prevent good policy from happening, but dangerous in the violence that can be ginned up, the hatred that can be ginned up, the real antagonisms. So I guess in that sense, that's the parting kind of like before we do our little chart was the parting kind of thought I would be curious about is sort of how you think citizens have to navigate that, how you encounter disagreement and walk through that veil of I'm hearing something that pings against my understanding of the world and my positions in the world. And that's not always a bad thing. And that's not always a reason to object strenuously to another person or argument. But it can be. And it's not always easy to rely on myself to discern accurately which it is, right? Because all those emotions and my own role, right, in how I approach these things, my own personal tendency to view someone disagreeing with me as an attack, to view information I don't like as bad and sick, or as a lie, can take over, right? And then I become useless because I'm no longer able to I'm no longer actually reading clearly what I'm taking in. So broadly, I think just your thoughts on how we as citizens in a big pluralistic democracy where there's lots of opinions and arguments flying around us, sift through the healthy disagreements from the manipulations.
Yeah, I guess, one of the things I try to do is avoid opinions. Like, I don't watch cable news where anchors are opining, and I don't want to hear uninformed opinions from politicians that are just citing their talking points. Well, that drives me crazy. When I do watch CNN, like I just kind of tune out because that just angers me that they're allowed to just spin PR and repeat talking points that may or may not be right all they're doing is reinforcing their ideology and their position. And to me, that's beside the point. Like, all I want is information and expertise. I want to see the scientist, I want to see the academic, I want to see the journalist, I want to see someone who understands the subject and can speak to it and inform me. And if I'm not being informed, then I kind of don't have time for it. I read a ton of nonfiction. And I don't want all of the, people bitching and arguing and spouting opinions on what they think because, unless it's an expert, and then it needs to be like a solution opinion. So I kind of stay away from a lot of that, so that my knowledge is, I guess, more intact. Like I don't want to, and if someone's speaking, if there's an artist speaking on their creative process or their history, that's different. But I try not to listen to, random opinions on stuff that may or may not have the facts to support them. And so whenever I hear that, I kind of push that away, which is why I can't watch cable news, to a nice degree, or listen to politicians being interviewed a lot of the times, because all they're doing is, I don't want ideology. I want ideas, and information, but I don't need, I know what you believe, and it doesn't really matter what you believe if the facts say something else. So I don't know. I guess that's kind of, part of how I steer clear of those kind of things. Unless it's insightful commentary, like the late night talk show hosts, making points about the day's news or something. That's satire, and that's, it's a different type of education, because they're pointing out the hypocrisy and the idiocy and the, it's not indoctrination in the same way that opinion, ideologues are, I guess.
No, I think that's all very fair. Probably dialing down our media consumption is good for all of us. Although no, dial up your consumption of this podcast.
Yeah. Well, I think it's fine to consume media that, again, is informing and educating and getting you to think. Right. And so I would just say, I dialed down social media. I would, I go to legacy journalism, the Associated Press or Reuters, or, if I want news, then I want real news. I don't want people giving me their opinion about news. I can't take the partisan online things.
Someday I'll kick my Twitter habit, but it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, it hadn't yet either, although who knows what the future of that holds.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say, that's one of the main things is when you seek out news, make sure it's news.
Right.
And if it's someone that has a political bend, then I'd steer clear of them because they basically told you that it's indoctrination. So.
Well, Samuel, but also Chris, I know you also go by Chris, but Samuel is your name on the book. But we have a chatter question we'd like to do at the end of this podcast, which is because we love places out of the way for people to recommend: book, store, restaurant, national park, state park, museum, cool little town, wherever it is, whatever it is, somewhere. I know you're originally from Louisiana, so if you want to mention there or somewhere else you've lived, just somewhere people come to one of your necks of the woods that if they wanted to do something a little different, a little unique, you would say you got to check this out for them.
Well, I'd say, let's see, bookstore. If you're in the Los Angeles area, the Last Bookstore in downtown LA is a very cool space. New books, used books. It's just it's got a great atmosphere and it's super cool to check out. I'm trying to think back home in Louisiana, the first thing that comes to mind. I guess probably where I used to go and eat all the time when I lived in Baton Rouge was the Chimes Bar and Grill right outside of LSU. Although that now there are a few locations. The Chimes was a staple of my early years. So
I'm always down for Louisiana food recommendations. As an Arkansan, I have to admit, excellent food down in Louisiana.
Yeah. Oh yes, a lot of good food back home. The seafood, you can't go wrong.
All right. Well, Samuel C. Spitale, the book is How to Win the War on Truth, an illustrated guide to how mistruths are sold, why they stick, and how to reclaim reality. It's been a blast. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
All right. And everyone else, we will be back soon with another episode of The Periphery. The Periphery is a production of the Pulaski Institution. I've been your host, Alan Elrod. Our music was written, recorded, and produced by Brandon Ragsdale and Cody Smith. Thank you for coming, and please join us next time.